Silas Pruitt would remember, for the rest of his life, the exact sound 2 bits made hitting his counter, the sound of a lie he'd carried 17 years starting, without his knowing it yet, to come apart. It's turned, Silas. Caleb Whitlock set the tin milk pail down on the counter like something he didn't trust himself to hold much longer, his daughter's empty bottle in his other hand. Gave her 3 swallows before I caught the smell. Poured the rest on the road so she wouldn't get at it again. Silas didn't look up from his ledger. Narrow man, narrow mustache. Sleeves gartered even in the cold, as if the cold itself owed him an accounting. Milk don't turn between here and your place, Whitlock. Half a mile of good road. It turned somewhere. Or it never was good to start, and you're wanting a second pail for the price of one. The store had gone quiet the way a room does when men sense a fight might be cheaper entertainment than the one they came for. A farmer's wife froze with a bolt of gingham half unrolled over her arm. 2 K hands leaned against the pickle barrel and stopped pretending not to listen. She's 4 months old, Silas. Caleb's voice stayed low, level, the voice of a man who had learned the hard way what happened when he let it go anywhere else. I got nothing else to feed her tonight but what's in that pail, and it's bad. Then I reckon you'll want to buy another. I paid for the first with the last coin I had on me. It was Addie who broke the silence, though nobody in that room but Silas Pruitt knew to call her anything besides Addie Merrick. She came around the dry goods shelf with a crate of canning jars on her hip and set it down on the counter hard enough to ring the glass. I'll take the milk back myself, she said. Mr. Pruitt keeps a second pail cooling in the spring house for the boarders. He won't miss it for one night. Silas's eyes cut to her, flat and quick, a man recalculating a sum he'd thought already settled. That pail's spoken for. Then I'll speak for it different. She was already lifting the till lid, and before Silas could close his hand over hers, she'd laid 2 bits on the counter, her own coin, not the store's. There. Bought and paid. Mr. Whitlock's baby eats tonight, and your springhouse pail's accounted for on the books, plain as anything. For a moment Silas looked as if he might argue the arithmetic of it, the way he argued everything down to the last button on a card of buttons. But 2 bits was 2 bits, and the room was watching, and Silas Pruitt valued an audience's good opinion nearly as much as his margin. He swept the coins into his palm without a word and went to fetch the pail himself, boots loud on the plank floor. Caleb looked at her a long moment. Not a tall man, but he stood like one, shoulders square even under a coat gone thin at the elbows, and there was a stillness in his face that made a person look twice, trying to read what sat behind it. I don't take charity, he said quietly, so it wouldn't carry past the 2 of them. It isn't charity. It's a bad debt collected on your behalf. Mr. Pruitt shorted you a pail of good milk, and I collected the difference. Settle up with me in eggs, if it troubles you so. Something eased at the corner of his mouth. We don't keep hens. Then you'll owe me a favor instead, and I'll think of a use for it eventually. She said it lightly, the way a woman says a thing she means to be forgotten by both of them, and turned back to her crate of jars as if the matter were closed. It was not closed, not for Caleb, who walked home that evening turning the exchange over the way a man turns a stone he's found in a field, wondering what it was doing there and whether it was worth carrying. And not for Addie, who watched him go through the frost-fogged window with the pail held careful against his chest, and felt, not for the first time since she'd come to Larkspur Hollow under a name that was not quite a lie but was not the whole truth either, the particular ache of being thanked by someone who had no idea what he was thanking her for. She had been Addie Merrick for 3 months, ever since the letter from her father's lawyer reached her in Cheyenne with the deed to the Callaway spread folded inside it like a threat. Adelaide Callaway, sole heir to 11,000 acres of graze and water rights that half the territory had an opinion about, had no intention of stepping off the stage into Larkspur Hollow as herself, to be measured and courted and resented in the same breath before she'd so much as seen the state of her own fences. So she'd come in on the mail coach 2 weeks early, in a plain wool dress, carrying a carpetbag instead of a trunk, and taken a clerking job at the only mercantile in town under her mother's maiden name, and she had listened. She had learned a great deal in 3 months. That Silas Pruitt carried debts on his books he never mentioned aloud and collected them in ways that never showed up as collections. That half the ranchers in the valley believed the Callaway heir would sell out to the railroad the moment she arrived, because that was what Eastern heirs did, and the other half believed she'd raise fences and cut off the North Water the way her father never had. That a young widower named Caleb Whitlock kept to himself on a hard-scrabble quarters section at the valley's edge. that his wife had died of a fever the winter past, that he had a baby daughter he was raising alone, and that no one in town said his name without lowering their voice afterward, as if there were more to say and better sense than to say it. She meant to find out what that more was. She had not meant, when she took the clerking job, to find herself defending a stranger's milk pail with her own 2 bits and feeling her pulse go quick and stubborn in her throat while she did it. The barquet hands had barely cleared the door before the talk started up again. Low. The kind of low meant to be overheard. "Whitlock's about done for, you ask me," said the taller one. A rope-scarred fellow named Ott. Pruitt's held his note since spring. "Man can't make a milk payment. He sure ain't making a mortgage payment. He'll lose the quarter section by first snow that sticks," the other agreed. Pruitt's had his eye on that water frontage a year now. Railroad wants a spur through there, and Pruitt means to be the man standing between the railroad and its money. Addie kept her eyes on her jars and her ears wide open, and felt something in her chest go cold and considering, the way it did whenever she came across a fence line that didn't sit true with the map. She had walked the north boundary of the Callaway Range twice now, in her plain dress and borrowed name, and the Whitlock quarter section sat square against Callaway water on its western edge. If Silas Pruitt wanted that land for a railroad spur, he wanted it badly enough to starve a man's baby over a pail of milk to get him talking foolish and desperate, the kind of desperate that signs papers without reading them twice. She said none of this aloud. She finished shelving her jars and watched Silas come back through from the spring house with the second pail, wiping his hands on his apron, with the satisfied look of a man who believed he'd lost nothing at all, and thought, not for the first time, that there was a good deal more in this town's ledgers than the numbers Silas Pruitt wrote down in ink. Caleb's cabin sat a half-mile out where the road gave up being a road and became a rutted track through sage and stubbled grass. And by the time he reached it, the frost had turned to a fine, stinging snow coming sideways on the wind. Josephine was crying before he got the door shut behind him, a thin, furious wail filling the one-room cabin end to end, and he set the pail on the table and got the fire built up before he let himself so much as look at her. "I know," he told her, lifting her from the crate that served as a cradle, holding her against his shoulder while he worked one-handed to warm a measure of milk in a pan. I know, it's coming." He'd built this cabin with his own hands 2 years back, when Mary was still alive and the two of them still believed a hard beginning was only a beginning. The kind every homestead had, the kind that got easier once the well was dug and the first crop was in. The well had come in sweet and the first crop had failed to drought, and the second to hail, and Mary had gone into a fever in the coldest week of a hard winter and never come back out of it, and Caleb had buried her on the rise behind the cabin where she'd said she wanted to be, with a view west toward the mountains she'd always claimed she could see clearer from there than from the porch. He didn't think of himself as a man owed anything by the world. He'd gone to war young and come home older than his years warranted, with a scar across his left palm from a saber he didn't care to describe to anyone who asked, and with a name some men in his old regiment still wouldn't say without spitting afterward, on account of a charge that had never once been true and that he'd never once been given a fair chance to answer. He'd come west to leave all of that behind him, and mostly he had. But a man carried what he carried, and some nights, rocking his daughter by a low fire with a borrowed pail of milk warming on the stove, he felt the weight of it plainer than others. He thought, too, of the woman at the mercantile counter, and the quick, unhesitating way she'd laid her own coin down without waiting to be asked, as if it cost her nothing at all to spend it on a stranger. He didn't know much about Addie Merrick beyond her name and the fact that she counted change faster than Pruitt himself and never once shorted a customer, not even the ones who might not have noticed. But he found himself thinking of her still. An hour later, Josephine finally asleep against his chest and the wind working at the cabin's north wall, and told himself it was only gratitude, the plain and ordinary kind, and nothing that needed further thinking on. He was wrong about that, though he wouldn't have admitted it yet even to himself. The snow hadn't let up by morning, still coming down fine and steady, when Addie walked the half-mile from her boarding room to the mercantile and found Silas Pruitt already at his ledger, a folded paper at his elbow that he covered with his forearm the moment the bell over the door announced her. "Morning, Miss Merrick." He said it the way he said everything to her, pleasant on the surface and calculating just beneath it, a man forever running sums behind his eyes. "Cold one." "It is." She hung her shawl on the peg and didn't ask about the paper, because asking was the surest way to see it vanish into a drawer before she got a look at it. She'd learned, in 3 months of clerking, that the things Silas Pruitt hid in plain sight told her more than anything he said outright. She busied herself at the shelves nearest his desk, restocking thread and buttons with unhurried hands, and watched from the corner of her eye as he finished writing, folded the paper once more, and slid it into the strongbox beneath the counter rather than the drawer where he kept the day's ordinary business. A paper that went into the strongbox instead of the drawer was a paper that mattered, and Addie Calloway, whatever name she was answering to, hadn't built her father's ranch back out of debt by ignoring papers that mattered. She would need to see inside that strongbox before the week was out. She didn't yet know how, but she'd learned patience in 3 months of counting another man's money and holding her tongue, and she thought, watching Silas turn the little brass key and drop it into his waistcoat pocket, that patience was about to be tested in earnest. The bell rang again before she could turn the thought over further, and she looked up to see Caleb standing in the doorway with the snow still catching in his hair and Josephine bundled against his chest. And behind him, riding up slow through the falling snow on a big gray gelding, a stranger she'd never seen in Larkspur Hollow before, watching the mercantile's front window with the particular stillness of a man who has come a long way to look at one thing. Caleb hadn't come in for the stranger. He'd come in, plainly uncomfortable about it, to return the 2 bits Addie had spent the evening before, laid out in careful small coin on the counter as though he'd counted it twice to be sure it was exact. "I said I don't take charity," he told her, not quite meeting her eye. "I keep my word on things like that. I never doubted you would." She didn't reach for the coin right away. "You didn't need to walk a half-mile through snow to prove it, though. I'd have trusted you for it." "I know." He said it simply, the way he seemed to say most things, without ornament, and there was something in the plainness of it that struck her harder than a more practiced man's flattery might have. "I wanted to all the same." Behind him the bell rang a second time, and the stranger came through the door on a gust of cold air, stamping snow from a pair of boots that had seen better country than this one, broad through the shoulders, graying at the temples under his hat, with the unhurried bearing of a man used to being deferred to. His eyes went once around the store, cataloging it, before settling on Silas Pruitt with an expression Addie couldn't quite read. "I'm looking for the man who holds paper on the old Whitlock quarters section," the stranger said. "Was told in Cheyenne that'd be you." The name landed in the room like a drop plate. Caleb's hand went still on the counter, half an inch from his returned coin. Silas Pruitt's face did something complicated and quick, gone before anyone but Addie, watching close as she always watched him now, could have named it. "That'd be me," Silas said, recovering smooth as poured syrup. "Might I ask your business with it?" The stranger's gaze slid, unhurried, to Caleb, and stayed there a moment, too long to be accidental. "My business is with the man standing on it," he said. "Name's Marshall Foss. I've come a long way to have a word with Mr. Whitlock here about a charge from the war that never did get properly settled." He let that sit in the cold air of the store, watching what it did to Caleb's face, and said nothing more. Nobody in the store moved for a long moment. The stove ticked. Somewhere out back a loose shutter knocked twice against the wall and went still. "That charge was settled," Caleb said. His voice had gone very quiet, quieter than Addie had heard it, and she understood suddenly that quiet was what fear sounded like on him. "Dismissed. I've got the paper says so, folded in my Bible at home." Dismissed ain't the same as cleared. Marshall Foss said it without malice, the way a man reads out a fact he has carried a long way and is tired of carrying. "There's men back east still asking where 3 months' pay for 2 companies went missing in the winter of '64, and your name's still the one written down for it. Dismissed for lack of a live witness. Don't mean innocent, means nobody could be found to swear otherwise. Once the war ended and men scattered." He looked around the quiet store, at the farmer's wife with her gingham forgotten on her arm, at Silas Pruitt standing very still behind his counter. "I ain't here to arrest anybody. I'm here because a new witness has come forward, back in Missouri, willing to swear different than what got written down at the time. I mean to hear you out before I carry his word anywhere further." Caleb's jaw worked once. "Who?" "Man goes by Elias Cordray now. Says he served under a paymaster named Ezra Pruitt in that outfit, and that Ezra Pruitt is the one who moved that money, and moved your name onto the paper to cover the moving of it." Foss said the name plain, without weighting it, and watched what it did to the room. Silas Pruitt's face had gone the color of old tallow. "I don't know any Ezra." "Didn't say you did." Foss's eyes stayed on him a beat too long to be idle courtesy. "Said I was looking for the man who holds paper on Whitlock's land." "That's you. By your own word not 5 minutes past." I expect we'll have more to discuss before I ride on. He touched his hat brim to the room in general, the way a man closes a door gently rather than let it be seen to slam, and went back out into the snow to see to his horse, leaving the mercantile full of a silence that had teeth in it. Addie found her hands shaking faintly as she set the last spool of thread back on its shelf, and she was furious at them for it, because there was nothing in the last 5 minutes that should have surprised her half so much as it had. She had suspected Silas Pruitt of forged debts and quiet land grabbing for weeks. She had not once suspected the shape of what he might have done to get himself the appetite for it. Caleb had gone very still, Josephine asleep against his shoulder, and when Addie looked at him she saw not relief but something closer to dread. The particular dread of a man who has spent 2 years building a wall around an old wound, only to watch a stranger walk in and start prying at the mortar. "You knew him," she said quietly. "Not a question. Never laid eyes on him before today." His voice had gone rough. "But I remember a man named Cordray. Quiet fellow, kept to himself same as I did. I always wondered why he never came forward when they hauled me up in front of the review board. Figured he'd moved on, same as everybody else who didn't want trouble following them home. And Pruitt, Ezra." Caleb's eyes went to the counter where Silas stood, wiping his palms slow and repeated on his apron though there was nothing on them to wipe. "Never heard that name in my life till just now. But there's paymasters, and a man can shed a first name easy as a coat if it suits him to." Silas, for his part, had recovered enough of himself to busy his hands with the ledger again, though his pen scratched too hard and too fast, and twice he crossed something out that did not look, from where Addie stood, like an honest mistake. She watched him work and thought of the strong box beneath the counter, and the folded paper that had gone into it that morning instead of the drawer, and felt the shape of a very large, very ugly picture beginning to come together in pieces she did not yet have all of. Marshal Foss took a room at the boarding house and made himself, for the next 2 days, a patient and unhurried presence about town, asking careful questions of anyone who would answer them, and writing the answers into a small black book he kept inside his coat, and Larkspur Hollow talked of little else. Addie found herself grateful for the cover of the gossip, since it left nobody with much attention to spare for the quiet way she had begun walking out to the Whitlock place most evenings after the store closed, a basket over her arm with whatever the mercantile had too much of that week. She told herself it was only Christian charity toward a man with a baby and no wife to help him through a hard winter. She stopped telling herself that on the 3rd evening, when Caleb met her at the door before she had even knocked, as though he'd been watching the road, and something in the easy, unguarded way he said her name undid the lie entirely. "You didn't have to walk out here again. I know." She held up the basket, cornmeal, and a jar of Mrs. Otterby's plum preserves. "She put up too many, and won't hear of anyone starving within a mile of her while she's got a full cellar. Josephine's asleep." He stood back to let her in anyway, and the cabin was warm and close and smelled of wood smoke and the particular sweetness of a baby's clean laundry, and Addie found she did not want to be anywhere else in the territory just then. She set the basket on the table and noticed, not for the first time, the careful, deliberate way Caleb did everything with his hands, coiling a length of rope by the door in a tight double loop she had seen exactly once before, on a mail pouch Silas kept behind the counter for the weekly stage. "Where'd you learn to tie a knot like that?" Caleb glanced at the rope, surprised by the question. "Quartermaster's hitch. Every man who served under a paymaster learned it, whether he wanted to or not. Ties a load down so it can't shift on a wagon bed, but comes loose with one pull if you know where to find the tail of it." He shrugged, as though it were nothing. "Funny, the things a man's hands remember longer than his mind wants to." Addie said nothing to that, but she filed it away carefully, the way she had learned to file away every small true thing in this town, because she had begun to suspect that the truth in Larkspur Hollow arrived in pieces too small to notice on their own, and only added up to something dangerous once a person had gathered enough of them. They sat by the fire a while, not talking of Silas or the marshal or any of it, talking instead of small things. The price of seed corn, whether the well at the Whitlock place would hold through another dry summer, the particular stubborn way Josephine refused to sleep unless she was held upright against a shoulder. It was, Addie thought, walking back to the boarding house alone under a sky gone hard and bright with early stars. The first ordinary evening she had spent in Larkspur Hollow since she'd arrived, and the thought frightened her a little, because ordinary evenings were not what a woman planning to sell a ranch and disappear back east allowed herself to want. She got her chance at the strongbox 2 days later, On a Sunday when Silas rode out to the county seat to see about a shipment of nails and left her to mind the store alone, as he had done a dozen times before without a second thought, because Addie Merrick had never once given him cause to be watched. The key he kept in his waistcoat pocket was not the only key. She had learned that much simply by being observant in a store for 3 months. There was a spare hung on a nail behind the flour sacks. Put there for the day, Silas misplaced the first one and never moved since, because men who believe themselves careful rarely believe themselves capable of being predictable. The strongbox held less than she expected and more than she wanted. A stack of promissory notes. Half of them from ranchers she knew by name, none of them looking quite like the notes she'd seen recorded in the store's open ledger. A land deed for the Whitlock quarter section, already drawn up and witnessed, needing only Caleb's signature and a date to be final. The sale price listed at a fraction of what the water frontage alone was worth. And beneath that, yellowed and creased soft with age and folding, a court document from a review board in Street Louis, dated the winter of 1865, bearing a looped, deliberate signature she had seen 100 times now at the bottom of 100 store ledgers. S. Pruitt, in a hand that made its S the same exact way whether it was signing for a crate of nails or swearing away a man's name to a crime. She stood very still with the old document in her hands, snowlight coming pale through the mercantile's front window, and understood 2 things at once. Cold and certain as creek water in December. The first was that Silas Pruitt had been Ezra Pruitt once, or near enough kin to him that the difference hardly mattered, and that he had built his fortune here on the strength of a lie he had told a war review board 17 years before he ever thought to tell one to a milk-pail widower in Wyoming territory. The second was that the forged deed beneath it, waiting only for Caleb's signature, was not a new scheme but the same scheme. Finished at last, 17 years and 800 miles later. She heard the bell over the door before she heard the boots, and she had the strongbox shut and the spare key back on its nail before Silas Pruitt was 3 steps into the store. Though not, she understood at once from the look on his face. Quite fast enough. You've been at my box. He said it flat, no longer bothering with the pleasant calculation that usually sat under his voice like a held breath. I know the way I leave a lock. You've been at it. I was dusting. Don't insult me with a lie, Miss Merrick, or whatever your name truly is, because I've had my doubts on that score a good while now, too. He shut the door behind him and turned the little bolt, and Addie felt the room go smaller and colder all at once. A clerk who counts change faster than I do, who walks the North Range on her days off same as a woman inspecting property she means to buy rather than admire, who took a room under a name nobody in this county can account kin for. I've wondered about you since your 2nd week here, Miss Merrick. I simply hadn't decided yet whether it profited me more to ask or to watch. Then watch a moment longer, and I'll spare you the trouble of wondering. Addie set the strongbox key down on the counter between them, deliberate, and let the silence stretch until it was hers instead of his. My name is Adelaide Calloway. My father held the deed to 11,000 acres, bordering your quarter section scheme on 3 sides. Mr. Pruitt, and I have been standing in your store for 3 months learning exactly the sort of man I inherited a neighbor in. Whatever Silas had expected, it had not been that. He went very still, and something moved behind his eyes that was not quite fear and not quite calculation but some ugly marriage of the two. A man recounting, in the space of a breath, every unwise word he had ever spoken in front of a hired girl he had believed beneath his notice. You've no proof of anything, he said at last. I have a court document with your signature on it, 17 years old, and a forged deed sitting not 2 feet from where you're standing, and a marshal camped at the boarding house not 400 yards from this door who came a long way already suspecting the very name you've been hiding under. Addie kept her voice level, though her heart was going hard enough now that she could feel it in her ears. I'd call that a fair beginning. Silas's hand moved, slow, toward the drawer beneath the counter where she had never once, in 3 months, seen him keep anything but string and wrapping paper, and Addie understood in the half-second before he opened it that she had misjudged how much room this man believed he still had to maneuver in. The pistol he drew was old, a cap-and-ball relic that had likely ridden with him since the very war he was trying so hard to outrun, and his hand shook faintly around the grip of it, which frightened Addie more than a steady hand would have, because a shaking hand belonged to a man deciding something in real time rather than a man executing a plan. You'll not ruin 17 years of careful building over an afternoon snooping, he said. And his voice had gone thin and strange, pitched higher than his usual measured drawl. "I built this store from nothing. I built that quarter-section deal from nothing. I am not minded to hand it back to a girl playing dress-up at poverty because her daddy left her more land than sense. Put it down, Silas." The bell over the door had not rung. Addie had not heard the latch, but Caleb's voice came from just behind Pruitt's shoulder, low and even. And when Addie's eyes went past the pistol, she saw that he had come in through the store's back storeroom door, the one that led onto the alley where deliveries were unloaded. Josephine nowhere in sight, left safe with a neighbor for the hour, his hands empty, and raised only slightly, not in surrender, but in the particular stillness of a man who has learned, somewhere hard, how to make himself the calmest thing in a dangerous room. Silas spun half around, the pistol swinging with him, and for one long, terrible second the barrel crossed the space between Caleb and Addie both, and nobody in the room breathed. "I ain't here to hurt you, Silas," Caleb said, not moving, not so much as blinking. "Marshall's outside. Heard raised voices through the wall and sent me round back to see was everybody safe. All you gotta do is set that down and let this get settled the way settled things get settled. In a court, with paper, same as everything else in your life's been settled up till now. And if I don't, then you'll have shot an unarmed woman and a man with a baby waiting on him at home, in front of a United States Marshal standing not 40 feet away, over a piece of land that ain't rightly yours to begin with." Caleb's voice never rose. "That ain't a debt you can write off in a ledger, Silas. That's the kind that follows a man the rest of his days, however many of them he's got left to spend." For 3 long seconds nobody in the room moved at all. Then Silas Pruitt's shoulders dropped, some essential rigor going out of him all at once, and the pistol wavered and lowered, and Addie let out a breath she had not known she was holding since the barrel first swung her way. It was not surrender, not truly, not yet. It was only a man realizing, in the space of a held breath, that he had run out of room to bluff his way through a hand he had already lost, and setting the cards down not because he believed the game was over, but because he needed time to find a new one to play. He set the pistol on the counter, slow, and Addie was already moving toward the front door to call for the marshal when Silas's eyes came up to meet hers one last time. And what she saw there was not fear settling into resignation, but fear settling into something colder and more patient than that. The look of a man already 3 moves further down a board nobody else in the room had seen him start to play. "You'll want to ask your marshal," he said, very quietly, almost gently, just how sure he truly is that this Cordray fellow ever served under any Pruitt at all. "Men say a great many things when they've been paid to say them, Miss Calloway. I'd have thought a woman clever enough to spend 3 months playing at poverty would have considered that already." Then the door burst open behind her, Marshal Foss filling the frame with his hand already on his pistol, and the room dissolved into shouted questions. And Josephine's neighbor's frightened knock at the storeroom door, and the whole cold machinery of a small town's justice grinding slowly, reluctantly, into motion, and Addie stood very still in the middle of it with Silas Pruitt's last words turning over and over in her mind like a stone she could not yet see the underside of, wondering, for the first time since she had watched Caleb Whitlock walk into her store with a pail of spoiled milk in his hand, whether the truth she had just wrung out of this room was the whole truth at all, or only the shape of it. Silas Pruitt had decided, even now, even cornered, he could still afford to let her see. It took the better part of an hour to sort the store into some semblance of order. Foss took the pistol and the strongbox both, the old court document and the unsigned deed sealed away together in a leather satchel he did not let out of his own 2 hands. And Silas himself was walked, protesting the entire way that a man's word ought to count for something in a territory that called itself civilized, to the small stone jail behind the courthouse to wait on whatever came of a wire the marshal meant to send east by morning. The farmer's wife had long since gathered her gingham and gone. The Barquet hands had vanished sometime in the commotion, no doubt already carrying the whole account to every bunkhouse within 10 miles. It left Addie and Caleb standing alone in the mercantile as the light outside went the flat blue of early evening. The stove burned down low, and neither of them, for a long moment, seemed to know what to say to the other. "Adelaide Calloway," Caleb said at last, testing the name the way a man tests ice before he trusts his way to it. 3 months I've known you as Addie Merrick. 3 months you've watched me count coin I didn't have to spare, and never once thought to mention you own more land in this valley than any 3 ranches put together. I didn't lie to hurt you. I didn't say you lied to hurt me. I said you lied." His voice was not unkind, But it was not soft either, and Addie found she would rather have had him shout at her than speak so evenly, because the evenness meant he was working hard to keep something larger contained behind it. I stood in this store and told you I don't take charity, and you let me believe I was arguing with a shop girl about 2 bits, when the whole time it was pocket change to you, same as it was to Pruitt. I've spent 3 months near enough falling for a woman who wasn't sure enough of me to tell me who she was. I wasn't sure of anyone in this town. Addie's own voice came out sharper than she intended, more wounded than she'd meant to let show. I came here because my father died and left me 11,000 acres and not one soul in this valley I could trust to tell me the truth about it, Silas Pruitt least of all. And I was right not to trust him, wasn't I? I watched a man draw a pistol on me not an hour past. Forgive me for wanting to know a place before I let it know me. There's a difference between wanting to know a place and standing in my cabin accepting cornmeal like a neighbor while you were sizing me up same as everybody else. He looked away from her, toward the window and the dark coming down blue and quiet over the street. I've had one name taken from me already. Addie. Had men decide who I was based on a paper with a lie written on it, and spend 17 years unable to argue different. I reckon I'm particular about names now, about who gets to decide what mine means, and who gets to hide behind one of their own while they're deciding it. Addie had no ready answer for that, because there was no version of it that was not true, and she had learned enough about herself in 3 months of clerking to know that the surest way to lose a person's trust for good was to argue with the fair parts of their anger. She reached instead for the only honest thing she had left to offer him. My name is Adelaide Calloway, she said quietly. That's the truth of it, and I should have given it to you the day you walked into this store with that pail, instead of 3 months and a marshal's pistol later. I can't undo the waiting. I can only tell you I'm done with it now. Caleb did not answer that either. Not that evening. He only looked at her a long moment in the low stove light, something unresolved and unhappy still working behind his eyes, and then he settled his hat and went to fetch Josephine from the neighbors. And Addie watched him go the same way she had watched him go the very first evening, through a window gone dark instead of frost fog, and understood that whatever she had built with him in 3 careful months now stood on ground every bit as uncertain as the deed Silas Pruitt had left unsigned in a marshal's satchel. She did not yet know that Silas Pruitt, sitting alone in the dark of the county jail with his knees drawn up, and his mind working faster than it had in 17 years, had already begun composing the letter that would undo a good deal more than a land deed before the week was through. The letter reached the county attorney 4 days later, carried by a rider Silas had somehow paid from inside a cell with nothing but a promise, and it did exactly the damage he had intended it to do. In it, Silas swore that Elias Cordray had written to him twice in the past year asking for money, and that when none came, Cordray had gone looking for someone willing to pay for a different kind of testimony altogether. He signed it with a flourish and a claim of persecution, a man wronged by a scheming heiress and a marshal too eager for a tidy case to look past what did not fit it. It was not proof of anything. But it did not need to be proof. It needed only to be doubt. And doubt was cheap to manufacture and expensive to clear away. And Marshal Foss came to the mercantile with his black book closed, and his face set in the particular grimness of a man whose case has just gotten harder without getting any less true. County attorney wants Cordray brought out here to testify direct, he told them. Missouri to Wyoming in winter. Could be a month before he arrives. Could be longer. And Pruitt's lawyer means to argue the deed stands valid regardless, since a signature under a threat of debt ain't the same as a signature under a gun. He looked at Caleb steady. I'm sorry, I believe you. Believing ain't the same as having enough to hang a verdict on. Caleb took it the way he seemed to take most hard things, quiet. His jaw set. Josephine asleep against his shoulder out of habit now more than necessity. A month, he said. I've got a mortgage note comes due in 3 weeks. Marshal, deed or no deed. Court or no court. Bank don't care who's guilty. Bank cares who's got the money. Addie had already begun doing the sum in her head before he finished saying it. No. Caleb said it flat, the same evening, standing in the doorway of his own cabin with the fire behind him throwing his shadow long across the yard. I won't take your money to pay off a debt Pruitt engineered to strip me of this land in the first place. That's not clearing my name, Addie. That's trading one kind of owing you for another. It's not charity. Everything you offer me starts out not being charity and ends up being exactly that. However you dress the word. His voice was not unkind, but it had an edge worn thin from 3 weeks of carrying more than one man's share of trouble. I've spent my whole life since the war trying to be a man nobody can say bought his way clear of anything. I won't start now, even for you, especially not for you. Then let me be a neighbor instead of a benefactor." Addie held her ground on his porch step, the cold coming up hard through her boots. "The Callaway Range runs grays I don't use on the North 40. Same water table as yours. I need a man to work it through calving season, and I'll pay a fair wage for fair work. Same as I'd pay any hand. You clear that note with honest coin you earned, not coin I gave you. And you tell me plain to my face if that's charity or if it's just two neighbors doing sense by each other." Caleb was quiet a long moment, turning it over the way she had watched him turn over hard things before, weighing not just the offer, but what accepting it would mean for the shape of a man he had spent 17 years rebuilding one careful decision at a time. "That's sense," he said finally, grudging but honest. "I can live with sense." It was not everything mended between them, but it was a beginning, and Addie found, walking back toward town under a sky gone hard with early winter stars, that a beginning built on plain dealing felt sturdier under her feet than anything she had built on a borrowed name. She found the letter 3 days later, not in the strongbox, which Foss had already carried off, but tucked behind a loose board in the storeroom where Silas had kept his private stock of good whiskey, discovered only because Addie had taken over the mercantile's accounts in his absence and gone looking for an inventory she suspected he'd never bothered to write down honest. It was old, the ink gone brown, dated the spring of 1866, and it was written in the same looped, deliberate hand as everything else Silas Pruitt had ever signed. Addressed to a man named Elias Cordray, it did not ask a favor. It threatened one, plainly and without dressing, reminding Cordray that a man who had once helped move a quartermaster's missing pay might find himself standing trial alongside the man he chose to accuse, should he ever think better of his silence. And that silence, properly kept, would be worth a yearly consideration Silas was prepared to send so long as it was. It was not proof that Caleb was innocent. It was proof that Silas Pruitt had known, for 16 years, exactly who was. She rode to the county jail herself the next morning, the letter folded inside her coat, Caleb beside her on a borrowed horse because he had insisted on coming and she had, for once, not argued the point. Marshal Foss met them at the door, read the letter through twice, and something in his face went from tired to something sharper. "This changes the shape of things considerable," he said. "Let's see what he says when he knows we've got it." Silas Pruitt looked smaller behind bars than he had behind his counter, his narrow mustache gone untrimmed, his gartered sleeves replaced by a plain shirt gone gray with jail dust. He looked up when the three of them came in, and whatever hope he had been nursing through the long cold nights of his confinement seemed to leave him all at once when he saw the paper in Foss's hand. "Where did you find that?" he said. It was not really a question. "Behind your whiskey, Silas." Addie kept her voice even, though her heart was not. "You kept the very proof that would hang you closer than you kept your own strongbox key. I expect some part of you wanted it found, sooner or later. A man doesn't hold on to a confession for 16 years by accident." Something in Silas seemed to give way then. Not gracefully, not with any dignity a better man might have found in the moment, but the way a fence gives way after too many winters of frost heave, all at once and past any hope of standing back up straight. "I was 26 years old," he said, and his voice had lost every trace of its old measured drawl. "I'd gambled away 2 companies' worth of pay in a fortnight, cards and worse, and I was going to hang for it, or near enough, and Caleb Whitlock was fool enough to leave his own name on a requisition form the same week mine went missing from the books. It wasn't cruelty. It was arithmetic. I needed a name that wasn't mine, and his was sitting right there. And I have spent every year since telling myself a man who never got convicted couldn't rightly call himself ruined." "He lost his good name," Caleb said quietly, and it was the first thing he'd said since entering the cell block. "Spent 17 years having men look at him different account of a lie you told to save your own hide. You don't get to call that arithmetic, Silas. That's a man's whole life you spent to buy yourself another decade of comfort. And when fate saw fit to set us down neighbors in the same valley," Silas went on, as though Caleb hadn't spoken, some old bitterness rising up now that the pretense of innocence had finally cracked all the way through, "I confess I took it as a kind of sign. Here was the very man whose ruin had bought my freedom, struggling on a quarter section not worth the water under it unless a man knew, as I knew, that the railroad meant to run a spur straight through it inside 3 years. I told myself taking his land wasn't cruelty either. Just arithmetic. One more time. The universe settling an old account in my favor at last. The universe didn't do any such thing, Addie said. You did. Same as you did the first time. There's no arithmetic in it, Silas. There's only a man who found it easier to ruin somebody else than to answer for his own mistakes. Twice over, 17 years apart. Silas said nothing further to that. He sat back down on the edge of his cot, and something in his face closed over entirely. The calculation finally run dry. He looked up once more, not at Addie, but at Caleb, and for a moment something almost like an apology moved behind his eyes before he thought better of it and let his gaze drop to the floor instead. I don't suppose it matters now, he said, quieter than before, but I never once believed you'd hang for it. Only that you'd carry the doubt, same as any man carries a limp. I told myself a limp wasn't ruin. I was wrong about that too. Same as I was wrong about a great many things I told myself over the years, when telling myself was easier than answering for them. No, Caleb said. It doesn't matter now. He did not say it cruelly. He said it the way a man closes a ledger on a debt he has decided is no longer worth the collecting, and turned to go, Addie falling into step beside him, and neither of them looked back. Marshal Foss folded the letter carefully back into his coat and told them, in a voice gone almost gentle with the particular fatigue of a lawman who has just watched a case come together and a man come apart in the same quarter hour, that he'd have what he needed wired east by morning, and Caleb Whitlock's name would be cleared of the charge for good inside the month. Deed voided, land his own free and clear. The whole matter closed the way settled things ought to be settled. In a court, with paper. At last. Spring came late to the valley that year, but it came at last, the way it always did, the snow pulling back off the high ridges in slow gray retreat, and the creek beyond the Whitlock cabin running loud and full for the first time in 2 dry years. Addie rode out most mornings now, not with a basket over her arm but with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, because calving season did not care what a woman's hands had once been used for, only what they could do now, and she had found, working the North 40 alongside Caleb through the last cold weeks of winter, that there was a particular satisfaction in a day's work honestly done that no amount of inherited acreage had ever taught her. The note came due before the trial did, and Caleb rode into town before sunup to settle it himself. 3 weeks of honest wages from the North 40 counted out in coin he had earned with his own 2 hands. The banker, a thin, careful man named Vance who held paper on half the valley one way or another, counted it twice over with the particular slowness of a man who has been told, by someone, to look for reasons to be slow. This clears the principle, Vance said at last. But there's the matter of the deed itself. Mr. Pruitt's lawyer filed papers Tuesday contesting the transfer, on account of the ownership question still being unsettled in court. Until that's resolved, the bank can't rightly say whose land this payment is even clearing. It's my land, Caleb said. Always was. I don't doubt it. Doubting ain't my job, Mr. Whitlock. Following the paper is. Vance slid the coin back across the counter, not unkindly, but final all the same. Come back once the courts spoke plain, and no interest accruing against you meanwhile. That's the best I can offer a man in your position. Caleb rode home with the coin still in his saddlebag and something harder than disappointment sitting in his chest, the particular weariness of a man who has done every single thing asked of him honestly, and still finds the ground shifting under him on somebody else's say-so. He did not go looking for Addie to tell her. He went instead to the fence line and worked until his hands were raw, because some kinds of trouble a man needed to wear himself out against before he could stand to talk about them. And it was there, 2 mornings later, that she found him. She found him one morning at the fence line where the Callaway water crossed onto Whitlock ground, mending a rail that had come loose over the winter. Josephine propped nearby in a basket lined with an old quilt, gumming a knuckle and watching the sky with the fierce, unblinking concentration only very small children seemed to manage. Bank cleared the note Monday, Caleb said, not looking up from his work. Wired the last of it myself. Honest wages, same as we agreed. Once Foss wrote out personal to tell Vance the deed question wasn't much of a question anymore. I heard. She dismounted and came to stand beside him, watching his hands work the wire with the same careful economy she had noticed the very first evening in his cabin, nothing wasted, nothing hurried. Mr. Pruitt's trial's set for the first week of June. Foss says it won't take the jury long, once they've heard Cordray's testimony alongside the letter. Good. Caleb straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers, and looked at her a long moment in the thin spring sunlight. The particular stillness in his face she had learned, over a hard winter, was not distance but its opposite, the look of a man weighing something carefully before he let himself say it aloud. I've been thinking on something else besides the note. Have you? This fence. He nodded at the rail he'd just mended, running the wire taut between his own land and hers. The two ranges meeting at a boundary that had once seemed, to Addie, the very shape of everything standing between them. Seems a foolish thing, don't it? Keeping up a fence line between two people who've spent a winter sharing everything on both sides of it anyhow. Water. Work. A baby who's taken to falling asleep easier in your arms than in mine, if I'm honest. Which I mean to hold against you exactly as long as it amuses me to. Addie laughed, surprised into it, and found her eyes had gone unexpectedly wet with something that was not sorrow. Caleb Whitlock, are you asking me to tear down a fence? Or are you asking me something else entirely and hiding behind the fence to do it? I reckon I'm asking whether a woman who owns 11,000 acres might see her way clear to sharing 1/4 section and a stubborn man who comes with it and see it as a fair trade rather than charity going the wrong direction for once. He said it plain, the way he said most things, without ornament, and Addie thought that plainness had never in her life sounded so much like poetry. I'd call that sense, she said, echoing his own words back to him from a doorway 3 months gone, and stepped across the last low rail of the mended fence to stand on his side of the line, where, it turned out, she had wanted to stand for longer than she had let herself admit even to herself. They were married in June, the same week Silas Pruitt's trial closed with a verdict nobody in Larkspur Hollow found surprising. In a ceremony held not in the church, which was too small for the whole valley to crowd into, but out under the cottonwoods along the creek where the Callaway water crossed onto what had once been Whitlock ground and was now, by the plain sense of two people who had learned to trust each other the hard way, simply home. Josephine slept through the whole of it in Addie's arms, one small fist curled against the collar of a borrowed wedding dress. And when Caleb bent to kiss his bride, the valley was loud with bird song and running water, and the particular, ordinary happiness of a life finally settled onto ground that belonged, at last, to noli et al.